Hello, friend. Welcome to Science for Sleep. Tonight, we're going to spend some time with a topic that often sits quietly in the background of many lives. Not because it isn't important, but because it's rarely spoken about in a gentle or accurate way. We'll be exploring the science of introverts and friendships, how friendships form differently for introverted people, how they are maintained, and why introverted behavior inside friendships is so often misunderstood. If you enjoy these quiet journeys, you're welcome to subscribe, and if it feels natural, to leave a comment sharing where you're listening from tonight. It helps others find their way to this calm corner of the world, one sleepy traveler at a time. The quiet continues here, just as it is. On a night like this, some listeners may already feel the weight of this topic without needing it explained. You may have noticed that making new friendships feels difficult in ways that don't seem to match your intentions. You may want connection, but find that the process of reaching for it feels heavy, unclear, or exhausting. Sometimes this shows up as silence, sometimes as distance, sometimes as a delay in responding, or a hesitation to reach out first. And from the outside, these patterns can be misread. Quiet can be mistaken for disinterest. Solitude can be mistaken for coldness. Thoughtfulness can be mistaken for detachment. Many introverted people carry an unspoken worry that they are somehow doing friendship wrong, that they are missing a social instinct others seem to have naturally, or that their way of relating quietly pushes people away without meaning to. What's important to know right from the beginning is that this concern does not come from a flaw. It comes from a mismatch between how introverted nervous systems are wired and how friendship is commonly expected to look. From a scientific perspective, introversion is not about shyness, rudeness, or lack of care. It is about how stimulation is processed, how energy is spent, and how the mind responds to social input over time. When social interaction begins, the introverted brain often engages deeply. It processes tone, meaning, nuance, and emotional context with precision. But this depth comes at a cost. Neurological studies show that introverted individuals tend to show higher baseline cortical arousal. This means the brain is already active before additional stimulation arrives. Conversation, social environments, and new relationships can therefore register as full much sooner. What looks like withdrawal is often regulation. What looks like distance is often preservation. And what looks like indifference is frequently care being managed carefully, rather than expressed loudly. Friendship, for introverts, tends to grow slowly. Not because the bond is weak, but because the foundation is being built with attention and stability, rather than repetition and volume. As we move through this exploration tonight, we'll gently unpack how introverts form friendships, how they maintain them over time, and why fewer connections often hold more meaning. We'll look at what happens in the nervous system during social bonding, how trust forms differently, and why introverted friendships often feel quieter on the surface, but deeper underneath. There is no pressure to relate to everything at once. Nothing here needs to be fixed or changed. This is simply an invitation to understand what has always been there. I'm glad you're here. Here, the idea of energy begins to matter. Not energy in the sense of motivation or effort, but energy as a physical signal moving through the nervous system. a measure of how much input the body can take in before it needs space again. For introverted people, social energy tends to behave like a smaller container that fills more quickly. This does not mean it empties faster because of weakness. It fills faster because more is being processed at once. When conversation begins, the introverted mind does not skim. It takes in tone, timing, facial shifts, pauses, emotional undercurrents. Even small exchanges can arrive layered, dense, and detailed. In the brain, this shows up as higher baseline activity. The system is already alert before the room becomes noisy, already engaged before the conversation deepens, already tracking before new information arrives. As stimulation increases, the signal adds up. Voices overlap, expressions change. Social expectations quietly stack on top of one another. What feels manageable for one nervous system may feel complete for another. Not overwhelmed, not distressed, simply full. When that fullness arrives, the body looks for balance. Attention pulls inward. Response is slow. The urge to step back appears without explanation. From the outside, this can look confusing. Someone was present, and then they were quieter, engaged, and then more reserved, warm, and then less expressive. But internally, nothing has gone wrong. The system is regulating input, the same way pupils adjust to light or muscles release after tension. This is why social energy for introverts is often described as limited, even though that word can feel misleading. It is not limited in value or depth. It is limited in volume. Introverted nervous systems tend to be more sensitive to stimulation tied to reward and alertness. Dopamine pathways respond differently, making high-input environments feel intense rather than energizing. What excites one person may drain another, not because of preference, but because of biology. As social input continues, the signal does not fade on its own. It accumulates. And when accumulation reaches a certain point, the system naturally shifts toward reduction. This reduction can be subtle. Fewer words, less eye contact, longer pauses before responding. None of this means connection has ended. It means the body is preserving the ability to stay present at all. In friendships, this pattern often appears early. Introverts may enjoy someone deeply, yet need space soon after an interaction. Not space from the person, but space from the input. Time alone allows the nervous system to return to baseline. Stimulus settles, signals quiet. The internal field clears enough for reflection and meaning to take shape. This is one reason introverted friendships may develop more slowly. Energy must be available not only to meet someone, but to process them afterward, to integrate what was shared, to let the interaction become familiar rather than overwhelming. In this way, energy is not spent and gone. It is invested, then given time to settle. When this rhythm is misunderstood, pressure often follows. Pressure to respond faster, to stay longer, to match the pace of someone else's nervous system. That pressure itself becomes additional stimulation. It adds another layer for the mind to manage. Over time, friendships that ignore this energy pattern can begin to feel heavy. Not because the people are wrong for each other, but because the pace never allows the system to recover. Friendships that respect this rhythm feel different. There is room for pauses without explanation, silence without strain. distance without damage. Energy refills in quiet ways, through stillness, through predictability, through the absence of demand. As the nervous system settles, the capacity for connection returns, not as performance, but as presence. In this way, social energy is not something introverts lack. It is something they protect, so that when it is offered, it remains genuine. And as the night continues, this understanding begins to soften earlier concerns. Because what once looked like inconsistency starts to look like rhythm. What once felt like distance begins to resemble care moving at a sustainable pace. The flow does not stop here. It simply moves more slowly, in a way the system can hold. Initiation is where the weight often appears. Not in the desire to connect, but in the moment just before connection begins. A pause that stretches slightly longer than expected. A breath held while words are arranged carefully. A message typed, reread, and left unsent for a while. This pause is not hesitation caused by doubt about others. It is the mind preparing for complexity. Before a friendship even starts, the introverted nervous system begins to simulate what may follow. Conversation is anticipated, not as a single exchange, but as a sequence. Tone, timing, response, expectation, and outcome all appear at once, layered together. In the brain, this shows up as higher anticipatory cognitive load. More activity occurs before engagement begins. The system is already working through possibilities before the first signal is sent. This is why initiating friendship can feel heavy without feeling fearful. There may be no anxiety, no negative belief, no avoidance. Just a sense that something is already being carried. Social risk is processed deeply in introverted individuals, not because the risk is seen as dangerous, but because it is seen as meaningful. Initiation opens a door to future interaction, future obligation, future input. Once the door opens, it rarely closes immediately. Messages lead to replies. Replies lead to patterns. Patterns lead to expectations. The mind registers this chain before the first step is taken. This is where the pause lives. Not as indecision, but as foresight. Draft messages often hold this moment. Words exist, but timing feels important. Invitations are considered quietly, weighed not by outcome, but by capacity. The question forming underneath is rarely, "Do I want this?" More often, it is, "Can I hold what follows?" Because connection is not experienced as a single event. It is experienced as a stream. For introverts, that stream carries detail, emotional nuance, subtle shifts, unspoken meaning. Anticipation brings all of this forward at once. From the outside, this can look like slowness or reluctance. From the inside, it feels like care being applied before contact begins. This is where self-blame often enters. A quiet comparison to those who reach out easily, who speak first without pause, who seem to initiate without wait. But the difference is not confidence. It is processing depth. The introverted mind is already engaged before engagement occurs, already spending energy, already accounting for what might be shared, received, and carried. This is why initiation can feel draining even before it happens. Energy is being used in advance. Neuroscience shows that anticipation itself activates many of the same systems as direct interaction. The body prepares as if stimulation has already arrived. Heart rate may change slightly. Attention narrows. Internal dialogue becomes more active. Nothing has gone wrong. The system is simply treating initiation as real input, not a theoretical step. This also explains why introverts may initiate less frequently, but with more intention. Each opening is considered a commitment of attention and energy, not forever, but forward. When initiation does occur, it often carries sincerity. The words are chosen carefully. The timing feels deliberate. The approach is thoughtful rather than casual. This does not mean the connection will be intense. It means it will be real. Understanding this shifts the story around heaviness. The pause before speaking is not a flaw. The unsent draft is not failure. The quiet consideration is not avoidance. It is the nervous system doing what it does best. Preparing thoroughly. Reducing unnecessary strain. Preserving the ability to remain present once connection begins. As energy settles after anticipation, clarity often follows. The message is sent, the invitation is offered, and the connection unfolds at a pace the system can support. Initiation, then, is not something introverts struggle with because they lack social instinct. It is something they approach carefully because they recognize what it truly involves. And in that recognition, the heaviness begins to make sense, not as resistance, but as respect for the depth that connection brings. Connection for introverts tends to follow a quieter path. Not a sudden crossing, but two lines moving closer over time. They do not collide or merge quickly. They travel alongside one another first, adjusting pace, noticing rhythm, allowing familiarity to form. This is the introverted bonding pathway. After initiation, attention shifts from anticipation to observation. The nervous system begins to look for patterns rather than novelty. How someone speaks when relaxed. How they respond when nothing is required. How the space between interactions feels. Trust in this pathway is not created through intensity. It is created through predictability. When interactions repeat in familiar ways, sensory load decreases. The environment becomes easier to read. Voices feel known. Pauses feel expected rather than uncertain. The mind no longer needs to scan as actively. It recognizes what is coming next. This is why repeated familiar faces matter so much in introverted friendships. Not because variety is unwanted, but because familiarity lowers the cost of attention. Each familiar interaction asks for less energy than the last. Tone does not need to be decoded again. Intent does not need to be inferred from scratch. Emotional context carries forward instead of restarting. Over time, this reduces the background effort of social engagement. The nervous system begins to associate the person with ease rather than alertness. Shared routines support this process. Seeing someone in the same setting, talking at similar times, moving through interaction without surprise. These routines do not make the relationship dull. They make it accessible. In the brain, predictability supports trust formation by reducing uncertainty signals. When uncertainty drops, defensive monitoring also drops. The system can relax its grip on constant evaluation. This relaxation allows depth to emerge naturally. Conversation slows. Silence becomes more comfortable. attention turns toward meaning rather than management. For introverts, trust often arrives quietly. There is rarely a single moment where it clicks into place. Instead, it settles, almost unnoticed, as the body learns that presence does not require constant adjustment. This is why introverted bonds may appear slow from the outside. They are not waiting to begin. They are already forming beneath the surface. Each repeated interaction adds a small amount of stability. Each predictable exchange reduces sensory demand. Each familiar rhythm strengthens the sense that connection can exist without strain. Over time, the two lines draw closer, not because effort increased, but because effort decreased. The relationship becomes something the nervous system understands, and what is understood feels safe to approach more fully. This pathway also explains why introverted friendships often deepen later rather than sooner. Once sensory load drops, emotional availability increases. There is more room to listen deeply, more capacity to respond with care rather than calculation. Nothing about this process is inefficient. It is optimized for sustainability. Rather than burning brightly and fading, introverted bonds tend to grow quietly and last. They are built on recognition instead of novelty, on steadiness instead of momentum. The difference is not in desire. It is in sequencing. First comes familiarity. Then comes trust. Then comes depth. By the time closeness is visible, the foundation has already been in place for a while. The bond does not need to prove itself loudly. It has already been felt. Understanding this pathway removes the sense that something is missing. The slow convergence is not hesitation. It is alignment taking shape at a pace the nervous system can hold. And as the lines continue to move closer, the connection begins to feel less like effort and more like presence. Not rushed, not forced, simply allowed to become what it is. For many introverts, friendship naturally gathers inward, not as a narrowing caused by lack, but as a focusing of attention. A small number of connections held with care, a few familiar presences that the nervous system knows how to carry. This is where the idea of fewer friends often becomes misunderstood. From the outside, a small circle can look like absence. From the inside, it often feels like fullness. Introverted bonding tends to favor depth over breadth. Not because quantity is rejected, but because each connection requires real cognitive and emotional investment. Attention is not spread thin. It is placed deliberately. When a bond deepens, the body responds differently than it does during casual interaction. Neurochemicals associated with trust and closeness, including oxytocin, are released more strongly when interaction carries emotional meaning. Depth-oriented bonding activates these pathways in a sustained way rather than in brief bursts. For introverts, this sustained activation matters. The nervous system is more responsive to subtle emotional signals. Tone, presence, and shared quiet all carry weight. As depth increases, the bond begins to feel regulating rather than stimulating. The body associates the person with safety instead of alertness. This allows closeness to exist without draining energy. Emotional investment also scales with cognitive effort. When more mental processing is involved in interaction, fewer connections can be held at once without overload. This is not a limitation of care. It is a reflection of how attentively care is applied. A small number of friendships allows the mind to remain engaged without fragmentation. Details are remembered, patterns are noticed, subtle shifts are felt rather than missed. This is why introverted friendships often feel deeply personal, not because intensity is constant, but because presence is complete when it occurs. Quiet conversations support this kind of bond. Words are chosen slowly. Silence is not rushed to be filled. Meaning settles between exchanges instead of being pushed forward. Shared silence becomes part of the relationship rather than a gap within it. The nervous system recognizes that nothing needs to be proven in these moments. Attention can soften without fear of loss. Holding fewer friendships also reduces the background demand of social maintenance. There are fewer threads to track, fewer expectations to manage, less emotional context switching. This reduction frees energy for depth. Rather than keeping many connections lightly active, introverts tend to allow a few connections to become richly layered. These layers build over time. Shared history accumulates. Small experiences stack quietly. The bond becomes textured rather than expansive. From the inside, this feels grounding. The relationship does not need frequent reassurance. Its presence is felt even in absence. Importantly, fewer friends does not mean less support. In many cases, it means support that is more stable, more attuned, more enduring. When difficulty arises, these bonds often respond with steadiness rather than urgency. There is room to sit with complexity, room to listen without rushing toward resolution. The nervous system recognizes this as safety, and safety allows deeper emotional exchange to occur without overwhelm. This pattern can be hard to see from the outside. Depth does not announce itself loudly. It reveals itself over time, through consistency rather than display. Understanding this reframes the idea of a small circle. It is not evidence of social failure. It is evidence of selective investment. Energy, attention, and care are finite. For introverts, investing them deeply often feels more natural than spreading them widely. The result is a style of friendship that may look quiet, but holds weight. Connections that do not need constant reinforcement to remain real. Bonds that feel less like activity and more like continuity. In this way, fewer friends does not mean less connection. It means connection shaped to fit the way the mind naturally works. Carefully, deliberately, and with depth that does not fade easily. Silence inside friendship carries a different meaning for introverted nervous systems. It is not a gap that needs repair. It is not an absence waiting to be filled. It is a state the body often recognizes as safe. When two people sit together without speaking, there is a noticeable shift in sensory demand. Voices no longer compete for attention. Language no longer needs to be shaped, timed, or interpreted. The nervous system is allowed to settle into a quieter mode of processing. For introverts, this reduction matters. Much of social effort comes not from emotion, but from managing expression, choosing words, monitoring tone, tracking response. All of this requires ongoing regulation. When silence enters without tension, those demands fall away. Neuroscience shows that comfortable silence is associated with nervous system safety. When the environment is predictable and non-threatening, the body reduces vigilance. Muscle tension softens. Attention broadens instead of narrowing. The mind no longer scans for cues that require immediate response. This does not mean awareness disappears. It changes shape. Rather than tracking outward signals, attention turns inward and relational. Presence remains, but performance drops. This is why silence in introverted friendships often feels intimate rather than awkward. The bond does not rely on constant signaling to stay intact. Connection is carried quietly, without reinforcement. Reduced verbal output does not indicate disengagement in this state. In fact, it often signals the opposite. When a person feels safe enough to stop filling space with words, it suggests that the relationship does not require maintenance in that moment. Nothing is at risk. Nothing needs to be secured. From the outside, this can be confusing. Silence is often culturally associated with disinterest or discomfort. But within introverted bonds, silence frequently marks trust. The nervous system recognizes that it can rest without losing connection. Sitting together without speaking becomes another shared experience. Not empty time, but unpressured time. Time where presence is enough. This kind of silence often develops gradually. It rarely appears early in a relationship. It emerges once familiarity has reduced uncertainty and predictability has lowered sensory load. At that point, conversation no longer needs to carry the relationship forward on its own. The relationship exists independently of constant interaction. Silence can also act as a signal of attunement. Two people sense when speech would add little. They allow the quiet to remain because it feels aligned rather than avoided. In these moments, the body stays regulated. Breathing remains even. Posture relaxes. There is no internal pressure to re-engage immediately. This is very different from silence caused by withdrawal or shutdown. In those states, tension remains present. Attention stays alert. The system does not rest. Settled silence, by contrast, feels neutral or warm. The body is not bracing. The mind is not rehearsing. This distinction matters. Introverted friendships often include long stretches of shared quiet that are not signs of distance. They are signs that distance is not required to maintain safety. The relationship does not collapse without constant stimulation. It holds its shape. Importantly, this does not mean introverts prefer isolation over connection. Silence inside friendship is not solitude. It is companionship without demand. There is still awareness of the other person, still a sense of shared space, still an emotional thread present beneath the quiet. This is why silence can feel nourishing rather than empty. It gives the nervous system a break while allowing connection to remain intact. Over time, these moments build trust. They show that the relationship does not rely on performance. That presence does not have to be proven through speech. The pressure to be interesting, responsive, or engaging dissolves. What remains is ease. Understanding this helps release a common fear. That quiet moments will be misread. That silence will create distance. Within introverted bonds, silence often does the opposite. It reduces effort. It deepens comfort. It allows the relationship to exist without strain. The connection continues, not through words, but through shared regulation. two nervous systems resting in the same space without urgency. And in that shared quiet, intimacy takes a form that does not need to announce itself. It simply stays. Misreading begins quietly, not with conflict, but with absence. A response that arrives later than expected. A gesture that remains subtle. A signal that does not announce itself clearly enough to be noticed. For introverts, expression often travels on a lower volume. Social signaling styles vary from person to person, shaped by the nervous system as much as by habit. Some systems broadcast frequently and visibly. Others communicate through consistency, tone, and presence, rather than overt display. Introverted signaling tends to fall into the second pattern. Emotion is felt deeply, but expressed with restraint. Care exists, but is not always externalized. Interest is present, but not constantly reinforced. This difference is rarely intentional. It emerges from how attention is managed. When the nervous system is already processing richly, there is less need to add additional output. Expression becomes economical rather than expansive. A nod replaces a long explanation. A brief message replaces ongoing commentary. Silence replaces verbal reassurance. From the inside, nothing feels missing. The connection is still active. The bond still exists. From the outside, however, these quieter signals can fade before they are registered. This is where misinterpretation often forms. Low expressive communication styles are frequently mistaken for lack of engagement, not because the signals are absent, but because they do not match common expectations of visibility. The nervous system of the observer may be tuned to different markers of connection. Frequent verbal affirmation, quick responsiveness, consistent outward enthusiasm. When these markers are not present, the absence can be filled with assumption. Distance is inferred. Disinterest is projected. Detachment is imagined. Yet neurologically, introverted communication often prioritizes internal regulation over external display. The body remains engaged, but conserves output to avoid overload. This conservation is not withdrawal, it is balance. Delayed responses offer a clear example. Time is taken not because the message is unimportant, but because processing is thorough. Words are considered. Tone is checked internally. Energy availability is assessed. By the time a response is sent, it often carries intention rather than immediacy. Minimal gestures function similarly. A small check-in may hold more meaning than frequent casual contact. A short message may represent a deeper level of presence than a stream of surface interaction. The challenge is that these signals are easy to miss if one is not attuned to them. Over time, repeated misreading can strain friendships. The introverted person may feel unseen despite genuine care. The other person may feel unacknowledged despite consistent presence. Neither experience is rooted in disregard. Both arise from mismatched signaling systems. Importantly, this misreading is not the fault of either side. The nervous system does not choose how it communicates most efficiently. It follows what allows regulation to remain intact. Introverts are often deeply relational. They track emotional shifts. They remember details. They hold concern quietly, rather than broadcasting it outward. But these forms of attention are not always visible in the moment. The connection exists internally, even when it is not displayed continuously. Understanding this reframes the idea of distance. What appears distant may simply be subtle. What appears detached may be internally anchored. When friendships account for this difference, pressure begins to ease. Expectations soften. Signals are read more accurately over time. The relationship no longer relies on constant proof of care. It learns to recognize care through consistency rather than volume. For introverts, being misread can be one of the most tiring parts of social connection. Not because misunderstanding hurts directly, but because it creates a need to explain something that feels natural. When explanation is not required, energy returns. Expression becomes more relaxed. Presence feels safer. Misreading fades when quieter signals are allowed to count. A delayed response is no longer a rejection. A minimal gesture is no longer absence. Silence is no longer assumed to mean withdrawal. Instead, these patterns begin to register as a different language of connection, one that does not demand constant translation, one that exists comfortably beneath the surface. As this understanding settles, friendships feel less fragile. Connection holds without needing constant reassurance. And what once looked like distance reveals itself as a quieter form of staying close. The cost does not always appear immediately. It accumulates quietly, like a steady hum that grows louder than necessary. At first, it feels manageable. Energy stretches, attention holds. But beneath the surface, the nervous system is working harder than it needs to. Forced social performance begins when expression no longer matches regulation. When output is increased to meet expectation rather than capacity. When the body stays in a heightened state to maintain connection that does not yet feel safe to relax into. For introverts, this often shows up as masking. Masking is not deception. It is adaptation. The voice becomes more animated than it naturally is. Responses arrive faster than the body would prefer. Expressions are amplified to signal engagement clearly enough to be received. On the outside, this can look like ease. On the inside, it carries cost. Neuroscience shows that sustained performance increases cognitive fatigue. The mind must track not only the interaction, but the performance layered on top of it. Tone is adjusted deliberately. Reactions are monitored closely. Energy is spent maintaining alignment with external expectation. This effort does not register as excitement. It registers as strain. When performance continues without recovery, emotional availability begins to drop. Not because care disappears, but because resources are being diverted toward regulation. The body prioritizes staying upright over staying open. Overextended conversations illustrate this clearly. A discussion continues past the point of natural closure. Signals of fullness appear internally, but expression stays elevated to avoid misinterpretation. Each additional moment requires more effort than the last. The hum grows louder. Sustained performance also blunts emotional responsiveness. Subtle feelings become harder to access. Presence becomes more mechanical. Connection shifts from felt experience to managed output. This is often misread as inconsistency. Warm at first, then distant. Engaged early, then withdrawn later. But the change is not emotional. It is physiological. The nervous system is seeking relief from overload. When performance is removed, energy returns slowly. But when performance is expected repeatedly, recovery becomes incomplete. This is why introverts may appear to pull back after periods of high social engagement. The system is not rejecting connection. It is restoring balance. Masking also interferes with trust formation. When expression is shaped primarily to be received well, authenticity becomes harder to sustain. Not because honesty disappears, but because regulation comes first. The body does not feel safe enough to lower its guard. Over time, this can lead to relationships that feel effortful even when care is present. The bond exists, but it does not rest. Forced performance asks the nervous system to remain alert longer than it can support comfortably. Alertness without threat becomes stress. This is where withdrawal begins to look protective. Stepping back reduces sensory load. Expression quiets. The system recalibrates. From the inside, this feels necessary. From the outside, it may feel abrupt. Yet the shift is rarely about the other person. It is about the cost of staying elevated beyond capacity. Importantly, this does not mean introverts cannot engage actively. They can, and often do. But when engagement is aligned with internal rhythm, it nourishes rather than drains. When it is forced, it depletes. Understanding this reframes withdrawal not as avoidance, but as recovery. The system is not closing, it is repairing. When performance is no longer required, emotional availability can return naturally. Presence becomes genuine again. Connection feels lighter. The hum fades. In friendships that allow expression to match regulation, this cycle softens. There is less need to prove engagement, less pressure to stay elevated. The nervous system can remain open without being overworked. And in that balance, withdrawal no longer feels like loss. It becomes part of the rhythm that keeps connection intact. Not dramatic, not final. Simply the body returning to a level it can hold. As understanding deepens, the cost of forced performance becomes easier to recognize. Not as failure, but as a signal that the system has given enough. And that quiet, once again, is part of staying present. Stability is where many introverted friendships quietly live. Not in constant contact, but in something more even. A rhythm that repeats gently without needing attention. A sense that the connection exists whether or not it is being actively expressed. For introverted nervous systems, stability reduces load. When a friendship is predictable, the body does not need to stay alert for change. There is no need to re-evaluate intent each time contact occurs. No need to re-establish emotional footing from the beginning. The system already knows what to expect. This is why friendship maintenance for introverts often looks understated. Not many check-ins, not frequent reassurance, but a steady presence that does not disappear. Predictable patterns matter here, knowing roughly when someone might reach out, knowing how they tend to respond, knowing that silence does not signal rupture. These patterns lower background vigilance. In the nervous system, long-term attachment strengthens when interactions feel reliable rather than intense. Consistency allows trust to remain active without constant reinforcement. The bond does not need to be refreshed through stimulation. This is where stability begins to replace frequency. Frequent contact can feel reassuring to some systems, but for introverts, it can also increase demand. Each interaction carries processing cost. Each message requires attention, timing, and response. When contact is consistent but spaced, the system can remain connected without becoming saturated. The relationship holds its shape even when time passes between interactions. This is why introverted friendships may survive long gaps without strain. The absence does not register as loss. It registers as space within an existing structure. Stability also supports emotional memory. The mind retains a sense of the other person even when they are not present. The bond is not dependent on constant reminders. When contact resumes, there is often ease rather than distance. Conversation picks up naturally. Tone returns quickly. The connection does not need to be rebuilt. From the outside, this can appear minimal. From the inside, it feels secure. Importantly, stability is not passive. It is maintained quietly. Care is expressed through reliability rather than volume, through showing up when it matters rather than often, through being consistent in tone, intention, and presence. This style of maintenance aligns with how introverted energy is regulated. It avoids spikes. It avoids depletion. It allows the nervous system to stay within a comfortable range. Over time, this creates durability. Friendships built on stability tend to last, not because they are constantly active, but because they are rarely threatened by absence. When life shifts, these bonds flex rather than break. There is less pressure to perform closeness, more room for change without fear. This also reduces emotional noise. There is less guessing, less checking, less need to interpret every silence. The relationship becomes something the body trusts. In this state, maintenance feels less like effort and more like continuity. The connection is simply there. Understanding this reframes what it means to keep in touch. For introverts, keeping in touch does not always mean staying visible. It means staying reliable. A friendship can be strong without being loud, present without being frequent, alive without constant proof. As stability settles in, the nervous system relaxes further. Connection no longer feels fragile. It feels held. And when a bond reaches this point, it requires surprisingly little to sustain. A message now and then. A shared moment when paths cross. A sense of familiarity that does not fade. The rhythm continues quietly, without escalation. Not because effort is lacking, but because effort has finally become unnecessary. The friendship is no longer something that must be managed. It is something that simply remains. And in that steadiness, introverted connection finds the space it needs to endure. As stability settles into a friendship, attention begins to narrow. Not in a limiting way, but in a focusing one. The field of input becomes smaller. Signals become clearer. The nervous system no longer has to divide itself. This is where one-on-one connection often feels most natural for introverts. With only a single point of engagement, cognitive load drops. There are fewer variables to track. One voice, one rhythm, one emotional stream moving at a time. The mind does not need to filter competing signals or shift focus rapidly. It can stay with what is present. In this setting, conversation tends to slow. Words arrive with space between them. Pauses are allowed to exist without pressure. Shared attention becomes the anchor. One-on-one interaction reduces the background effort of social processing. Facial expressions are easier to read. Tone is easier to follow. Meaning does not get lost among overlapping cues. Because of this, the nervous system remains regulated for longer periods. Energy is not spent managing excess stimulation. It can be directed toward understanding, listening, and responding with care. This is where depth begins to feel accessible. Depth increases emotional safety by allowing attention to remain coherent. The body does not need to stay alert for interruption. The relationship feels contained rather than scattered. In these moments, introverts often appear more expressive. Not louder, but clearer. More present. More responsive. This is not because personality has changed. It is because the environment has aligned with how the system works. Slow dialogue supports this alignment. There is time to consider what is being said. Time to notice internal response. Time to speak without rushing to keep pace. The nervous system recognizes this as safety, and safety allows openness to emerge without effort. Shared attention also strengthens emotional connection. When focus is not divided, subtle emotional cues are easier to sense. Small shifts in tone or posture register more clearly. This allows attunement to deepen naturally, not through intensity, but through accuracy. One-on-one connection also reduces the need for social performance. There is less pressure to signal engagement continuously. Presence is evident simply through being there. The relationship does not require amplification to remain active. Over time, this setting becomes associated with ease. The body learns that connection does not have to cost regulation. The bond becomes a place where energy can rest rather than deplete. This is why introverted friendships often thrive in quieter, more focused spaces. A walk, a shared meal, sitting together without competing demands. These environments support sustained connection without overload. Importantly, one-on-one connection does not mean exclusivity. It means clarity. The nervous system can fully inhabit the interaction without splitting attention. This allows emotional availability to remain steady rather than fluctuating. When depth is allowed to unfold this way, trust strengthens. Not because more is shared, but because what is shared is fully held. The relationship becomes something the body recognizes as coherent. There is a beginning, a middle, and a natural pause. Nothing bleeds into everything else. As stability continues, one-on-one connection often becomes the foundation for introverted social life. Other interactions may exist, but this form remains central. It is not chosen out of avoidance. It is chosen because it fits. The focus narrows. The noise fades. The connection feels whole. In this space, introverted strengths come forward without strain. Listening deepens. Responses feel grounded. Care moves easily. The bond does not need to compete for attention. It has it. And when the interaction ends, the nervous system does not feel scattered. It feels complete. This is the quiet power of one-on-one connection. Not dramatic, not intense. Simply aligned. A single point of focus held gently, long enough for real connection to take shape. When more inputs enter the space, the picture begins to blur, not suddenly, but gradually. Voices overlap, attention splits. The nervous system starts tracking more than one stream at a time. This is where group settings often become difficult for introverted minds. In a group, information arrives from many directions at once. Speech, movement, facial expression, timing, social hierarchy, unspoken expectations. Each signal asks to be processed alongside the others. The brain does not receive these inputs in sequence. They arrive together. Multi-source input increases cognitive load quickly. Attention must shift rapidly between speakers. Meaning must be reconstructed from partial cues. Context must be updated continuously as the conversation changes direction. For introverted nervous systems, this level of simultaneous processing requires sustained effort. It is not the presence of people that creates strain. It is the density of information. As more voices enter, individual signals lose clarity. Tone becomes harder to follow. Pauses are interrupted. Meaning fragments. The mind compensates by increasing alertness. Attention sharpens. Muscle tension rises slightly. Internal monitoring becomes more active. This heightened state can feel like engagement at first. Energy is present. Awareness is wide. But maintaining this level of processing over time is costly. As the group interaction continues, fatigue appears quietly. Response is slow. Expression becomes more minimal. The body looks for ways to reduce input. This is where withdrawal often begins. Withdrawal in group settings is not rejection. It is regulation. Reducing participation lowers sensory demand. Stepping back from conversation reduces the number of signals being tracked. The nervous system moves toward balance. From the outside, this shift can look like disengagement. Less speaking, less eye contact, a quieter presence. But internally, the system is restoring capacity. Neuroscience shows that when cognitive load exceeds processing ability, the brain naturally seeks simplification. One way it does this is by limiting output and narrowing focus. In group settings, narrowing focus often means observing rather than participating. This observation is not passive. The mind is still engaged, but in a less demanding way. Listening instead of responding. Tracking the overall flow rather than each detail. Over time, this allows regulation to return. The challenge is that group norms often reward visible participation. Speaking up, reacting quickly, maintaining a consistent outward presence. When introverts shift toward regulation, the contrast becomes noticeable. This can create guilt, a sense of having failed socially, a worry about appearing rude or uninterested. But the withdrawal is not personal. It is physiological. The nervous system has reached its threshold for simultaneous input. Importantly, this threshold is not fixed. It depends on duration, familiarity, emotional context, and energy availability. Even introverts who enjoy group interaction may find that capacity changes over time. Early engagement gives way to quieter participation. Not because interest fades, but because processing demand accumulates. When withdrawal is allowed without judgment, recovery happens more quickly. The system recalibrates. Energy returns. When withdrawal is resisted or overridden, fatigue deepens. This is why some introverts leave group settings feeling drained even when nothing negative occurred. The cost came from sustained processing, not emotional distress. Understanding this removes blame from avoidance. Choosing not to engage fully in group dynamics is not a failure of social skill. It is an adjustment to cognitive reality. One-on-one safety contrasts sharply here. With fewer inputs, the system can remain open longer. In groups, openness must be rationed. Neither state is wrong. They simply place different demands on the nervous system. When this difference is understood, guilt begins to loosen. Quiet participation no longer feels like inadequacy. Stepping back no longer feels like loss. The body is doing what it needs to do to stay regulated. Withdrawal restores balance by reducing complexity. Attention can settle. Breathing steadies. The internal field clears. From this state, connection remains possible. Just quieter. Just less visible. Group dynamics do not need to be avoided to be respected. They need to be navigated in a way that honors processing limits. When introverts allow themselves to withdraw without judgment, regulation returns more smoothly. Energy becomes available again for deeper, more sustainable forms of connection. The blur softens. Signals separate. The nervous system settles. And in that settling, the quiet choice to step back reveals itself not as absence, but as care for the system that carries connection forward. Trust, for introverted friendships, rarely arrives all at once. It gathers slowly, through accumulation rather than exposure. Not through frequent interaction, but through repeated experiences that feel safe enough to settle. Each interaction leaves a trace, a small signal stored quietly in the nervous system. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent. Over time, these traces begin to stack. This is how trust forms in introverted bonding. The nervous system does not respond primarily to how much contact occurs. It responds to how predictable that contact feels. When interactions unfold in ways that are familiar, the body relaxes its monitoring. There is less scanning for change, less preparation for uncertainty. Repeated safe interactions gradually reduce background vigilance. Safety here does not mean perfection. It means consistency. Tone remains steady. Boundaries remain intact. Responses feel proportionate rather than surprising. The body notices this pattern even when the conscious mind is not focused on it. With each familiar exchange, the system learns that engagement does not require defense. This learning is slow but durable. Emotional safety must be present before openness can emerge. Without safety, expression stays guarded. The system prioritizes regulation over vulnerability. Once safety is established, openness becomes less costly. This is why introverted friendships often deepen after a long period of seeming steadiness. The early stages are not empty, they are calibrating. Shared history plays a central role here. Small moments remembered over time. Inside references, recognizable rhythms. These shared elements signal continuity. The nervous system recognizes that the relationship exists across time, not just in the present moment. Connection does not reset each time contact resumes. It continues quietly beneath the surface. This continuity reduces the need for constant reassurance. Trust is no longer something that must be re-earned repeatedly. It is carried forward. Importantly, exposure alone does not build this kind of trust. Frequent interaction without safety can increase alertness rather than reduce it. The body learns not from repetition alone, but from the quality of repetition. When interactions feel emotionally neutral or supportive, regulation improves. When they feel unpredictable or demanding, vigilance stays high. For introverts, trust forms when interaction becomes easy to hold. The body stops bracing. Breathing settles. Attention softens. This is when openness begins to appear naturally, not as disclosure, but as presence. Responses feel less guarded. Silence becomes easier. Expression becomes more genuine without effort. There is no clear moment where trust announces itself. It simply becomes noticeable in its absence. The nervous system no longer prepares for impact. It expects steadiness. This is why introverted trust can feel invisible at first. It does not announce itself through intensity or speed. It reveals itself through ease. Shared history continues to deepen this state. The relationship gains texture. Meaning accumulates quietly. Small misunderstandings resolve without escalation. Absence does not trigger alarm. Return does not require repair. The bond holds. This pattern often contrasts with cultural expectations around closeness. But it is not weaker for being quiet. Trust built slowly tends to be resilient. It does not depend on momentum. It survives change. When life shifts, these relationships adapt rather than fracture. The nervous system already knows what to expect from the connection. It does not need to reassess safety from the beginning. Understanding this reframes the pace of introverted friendships. Slowness is not delay. It is integration. Each interaction is being woven into a stable internal representation of the other person. Once that representation feels secure, openness follows without pressure. Nothing has to be forced. Trust emerges because the system has learned over time that connection can exist without cost. Not loudly, not suddenly, but steadily. And once trust is present, it does not require constant activation to remain real. It simply stays, carried quietly in shared history and familiar rhythm. This is trust as accumulation, built not through exposure, but through safety repeating itself until the body believes it. Expansion is rarely the goal. For introverted friendships, growth tends to happen inward rather than outward. Not by adding more connections, but by allowing existing ones to settle more deeply. This is why introverts often do not chase social expansion. It is not disinterest in people. It is sensitivity to arousal. Novelty increases stimulation in the nervous system. New environments, new personalities, new expectations all arrive with heightened signal. Attention sharpens. Alertness rises. For a time, this can feel engaging, but sustained novelty keeps the system activated. Familiarity, by contrast, lowers the cost of attention. Known voices require less decoding. Predictable rhythms reduce uncertainty. The nervous system spends less effort monitoring and more effort simply being present. This difference shapes how connection is chosen. As trust forms, the body begins to associate certain people with regulation. The presence feels easier to hold. The interaction fits within the system's natural range. Adding more connections reintroduces novelty. Each new bond asks the nervous system to adapt again. New patterns must be learned, new expectations integrated. This does not mean new relationships are avoided. It means they are approached selectively. Selective does not mean closed. It means intentional. The nervous system recognizes when capacity is already full. Energy has been allocated. Attention is engaged. Chasing expansion beyond that point increases load without increasing safety. For introverts, depth often provides what breadth cannot. A few stable connections meet relational needs without overwhelming the system. This preference is not static. It shifts with life stages, energy availability, and context. But the underlying pattern remains. Novelty continues to register as arousing. Familiarity continues to conserve energy. This is why introverted social circles often appear stable over long periods. Connections are added slowly, if at all. Not because opportunity is absent, but because capacity is respected. The nervous system learns which bonds are regulating. Those bonds are protected. Selective invitations reflect this process. Time and energy are offered where they can be held without strain, where interaction does not require constant adjustment. This selectivity reduces background stress. There are fewer contexts to manage, fewer emotional signals to track. The system can remain within a comfortable range more consistently. Importantly, this pattern does not indicate fear of growth. It indicates an understanding of how growth feels internally. Expansion that exceeds regulation does not feel expansive. It feels destabilizing. Introverts often sense this before it becomes obvious. The body signals when stimulation is tipping toward overload. Attention becomes restless. Recovery takes longer. Rather than pushing through, the system pulls inward. This inward movement is not retreat. It is consolidation. Existing bonds are given space to deepen. Shared history is allowed to accumulate. Trust is reinforced. Over time, this creates a network that feels solid rather than wide, supportive rather than busy. This solidity allows introverts to remain socially connected without being constantly activated. From the outside, it can look like stagnation. From the inside, it feels like balance. The nervous system does not crave endless novelty. It craves safety. Once safety is present, the need for expansion lessens. This does not mean curiosity disappears. It means curiosity is expressed within limits that protect regulation. New connections may still form, but they are integrated slowly, only when space exists. This pacing prevents dilution of attention. Care remains focused. Presence stays genuine. Understanding this removes pressure to grow socially in visible ways. A stable circle is not a sign of missing out. It is a sign of alignment. Energy is being used where it matters most. The boundary forms naturally, not as a wall, but as a gentle curve around what is already held. Within that boundary, connection remains alive. Outside of it, novelty waits without urgency. And in that balance, introverted friendships continue to develop quietly, without the need to expand simply for expansion's sake. The system rests where it knows how to rest. Connection does not disappear simply because it is not being signaled. For introverted friendships, presence often continues quietly, even when contact pauses. Not as neglect, not as distance, but as something held internally rather than expressed outwardly. This is where emotional availability without constant contact becomes possible. The nervous system is capable of maintaining an internal representation of connection. The other person remains present in memory, tone, and feeling, even when interaction is not occurring. This capacity is sometimes referred to as emotional object permanence. It allows attachment to persist without continuous reinforcement. For introverts, this internal continuity is especially strong. The bond does not reset when silence appears. It remains active beneath the surface. This is why long gaps in communication often do not feel alarming. The relationship does not feel threatened by absence. It feels paused rather than broken. Attachment does not decay in a straight line. It does not weaken steadily with time away. Instead, it holds its shape until disrupted by something meaningful. The nervous system tracks safety more than frequency. When past interactions have been consistent and regulating, the body assumes continuity during absence. There is no urgent need to re-establish connection immediately. No internal alarm signaling loss. This allows emotional availability to remain intact even during long periods without contact. Care does not disappear. It stays stored. When contact resumes, the bond often reactivates smoothly. Conversation finds its rhythm quickly. Tone returns without effort. There is little need for repair because nothing felt damaged. This pattern can be difficult to explain outwardly. Absence is often interpreted as disengagement, silence as neglect. But internally, the relationship has remained present the entire time. Long gaps followed by ease reflect this continuity. The nervous system recognizes the familiar signal and responds without hesitation. There is no need to warm up from nothing. Emotional availability without constant contact also reduces pressure within the friendship. There is less monitoring of responsiveness, less counting of messages, less concern about maintaining visibility. The relationship exists beyond interaction. This reduces anxiety around availability. The system does not need to stay partially activated to protect the bond. It can rest fully during absence. Importantly, this does not mean emotional disengagement. Thoughts of the other person may still arise. Care may still influence behavior indirectly. The difference is that expression is not required for attachment to remain real. This allows introverted friendships to stretch across time and distance. Life changes do not automatically weaken the bond. Periods of focus elsewhere do not erase connection. The nervous system understands that closeness can persist without constant input. This understanding also protects emotional capacity. Energy is not drained by maintaining continuous signaling. Availability remains reserved for moments when connection is actually occurring. When those moments arrive, presence is often full rather than partial. The relationship benefits from this rhythm. Contact feels intentional rather than obligatory. Interaction feels chosen rather than maintained out of fear. Attachment remains stable because it is not being tested constantly. Understanding this reframes absence. It is not a gap to be closed. It is space within an existing structure. Emotional availability does not require continuous output. It requires safety. Once safety is established, connection becomes something that can be carried quietly. It does not need to be reminded of itself. For introverts, this is one of the most sustaining aspects of friendship. The ability to remain connected without constant demand. The freedom to let presence ebb and return naturally. Care stays intact. Trust remains unshaken. The bond holds its form even when unseen. And when contact resumes, there is often a sense of ease rather than distance, as if the relationship simply took a breath. Not because anything was missing, but because nothing needed to be proven. Connection, in this form, persists without signal. It lives in continuity rather than frequency, and it allows introverted friendships to endure quietly without requiring constant touch to remain alive. Repair in introverted friendships often happens without announcement. There is rarely a formal moment where something is named, examined, and resolved aloud. Instead, repair tends to occur through return, through steadiness, through the quiet resumption of normal rhythm. When tension or misunderstanding appears, the nervous system first turns inward, not to avoid, but to stabilize. The mind registers the disruption as a change in pattern. Tone feels slightly off, timing shifts, energy becomes less even. Before expression occurs, regulation is restored. This is an important distinction. Repair does not begin with explanation. It begins with balance. The nervous system must first feel safe enough to re-engage. Without that safety, words feel risky. Emotion feels too exposed. So repair unfolds indirectly. Contact may pause briefly. Interaction may soften. Attention narrows toward familiar ground. This is not withdrawal meant to punish or distance. It is the system reducing stimulation so that clarity can return. Once regulation stabilizes, connection resumes. Often, no explicit conversation is needed. The relationship returns to its familiar tone. The disruption fades as predictability reasserts itself. From the outside, this can look like nothing happened. From the inside, something important has occurred. The nervous system has tested whether the bond can absorb strain without collapsing. When it does, trust deepens. This is why introverted friendships often feel resilient without dramatic repair rituals. They rely on continuity rather than confrontation. Repeated safe interactions following tension send a powerful signal. The relationship endured change. The bond did not break. Safety remained. This reinforces emotional stability. The mind learns that not every rupture requires verbal processing to be resolved. Some resolve through return alone. Shared history plays a role here. Past experiences of steadiness create confidence that the relationship can hold discomfort. Silence does not automatically mean rejection. Distance does not automatically mean loss. Because of this, repair does not feel urgent. It feels allowed to unfold at a pace the nervous system can tolerate. Importantly, this does not mean introverts avoid accountability or emotional awareness. It means expression is timed to regulation. Words are chosen once the system is calm enough to use them accurately. If calm returns without words, expression may no longer be necessary. This approach reduces escalation. There is less reactive language, less defensiveness. the relationship is not pulled into intensity unnecessarily. Repair through steadiness also preserves energy. The nervous system does not have to stay activated to manage conflict. It can settle back into familiar patterns. Over time, this creates a sense of safety around imperfection. Missteps do not threaten the bond. They are absorbed into its structure. This is especially important for introverted friendships, where energy conservation supports longevity. Repair that requires minimal stimulation is easier to sustain. The bond grows stronger not because conflict never occurs, but because it does not overwhelm regulation. When words are eventually shared, they often carry clarity. Emotion is less raw. Intent is easier to express. But even without explicit discussion, repair can be real. The relationship feels intact again. Ease returns. Connection stabilizes. Understanding this reframes what repair looks like. It does not have to be loud to be effective. It does not have to be immediate to be genuine. Quiet return can be a form of care. For introverts, this style of repair aligns with how the nervous system maintains safety. Stability first, expression second if needed, and in many cases, the relationship heals simply by continuing. The rhythm resumes, the tone evens out, the connection holds. Repair has occurred, not through confrontation, but through continuity. Nothing dramatic, nothing performative. Just the bond proving, once again, that it can survive a moment of disruption without losing itself. And in that proof, trust deepens quietly, becoming part of the relationship's foundation rather than a moment that needed to be marked. Recovery is not separate from friendship for introverted nervous systems. It is part of how friendship is sustained. After connection, even connection that feels safe and meaningful, the body often turns inward again. Not to disconnect, not to disengage, but to rebalance. Social interaction, no matter how positive, creates stimulation. Attention has been directed outward. Signals have been processed. Emotional information has been held. Once interaction ends, the nervous system begins to settle. This settling is not emptiness. It is integration. The mind replays fragments quietly. Tone, moments, meaning. Nothing is analyzed aggressively. The system is simply absorbing what occurred. This is why recovery time matters so much for introverts. Without it, stimulation accumulates faster than it can be processed. When recovery is allowed, regulation returns smoothly. Breathing evens, attention softens, internal space widens. The nervous system moves back toward baseline. Importantly, this recovery does not reduce connection. It preserves it. By allowing the system to settle, emotional availability is protected for future interaction. Energy is not depleted beyond repair. Presence remains accessible. This is often misunderstood as needing distance from people. But the distance is not relational. It is physiological. The bond remains intact during recovery. Care does not fade. Interest does not disappear. The relationship is simply not being actively processed in that moment. Neuroscience supports this pattern. Periods of reduced stimulation allow the brain to consolidate experience. Memory integrates more effectively when input pauses. Emotional regulation improves when arousal decreases. This makes future interaction feel easier rather than heavier. When recovery is skipped or shortened, the opposite occurs. Stimulation stacks. Fatigue increases. The body begins to associate connection with cost. Over time, this can create avoidance, not because connection is unwanted, but because recovery has been insufficient. For introverts, spacing interactions naturally prevents this buildup. Time alone is not withdrawal from friendship. It is maintenance of capacity. This is why introverted friendships often include natural ebb and flow. Contact, pause, return. The pause is not empty, it is restorative. During recovery, the nervous system recalibrates its thresholds. Sensory input quiets. Internal rhythm reasserts itself. When contact resumes after this recalibration, presence feels grounded rather than strained. The friendship benefits from this cycle. Without recovery, even stable bonds can begin to feel effortful. With recovery, they remain nourishing. This pattern also explains why introverts may hesitate to stack social interactions close together. It is not anticipation of failure. It is recognition of capacity. The system knows how much it can hold comfortably. It signals when integration is needed. Listening to that signal preserves connection rather than harming it. Importantly, recovery does not require isolation. It requires reduced demand. Quiet activities, solitude, familiar environments. These conditions allow the nervous system to reset without cutting relational ties. The bond remains present internally, while stimulation decreases externally. Over time, introverts learn to trust this rhythm. Engage fully, withdraw gently, return when regulation has been restored. This rhythm is not inconsistent. It is cyclical. Friendships that allow for this cycle tend to feel sustainable. There is less burnout, less resentment, less pressure to perform continuously. Connection remains something that can be entered willingly rather than endured. Understanding recovery as part of friendship reframes absence. The pause is not a problem to solve. It is a process to respect. When recovery is honored, the nervous system remains open to connection rather than closing against it. The relationship benefits from clarity rather than overload, presence rather than exhaustion. And over time, this cycle of engagement and rest becomes familiar, predictable, safe. The bond learns that connection does not require constant activation to remain real. It requires space to settle. In that space, friendship continues quietly, not fading, not weakening, simply resting, so that when it returns to the foreground, it does so with ease rather than effort. Expectation is often where strain quietly enters introverted friendships, not through conflict, but through mismatch. What one nervous system assumes is understood, another may be waiting to see expressed. For introverts, many relational expectations live internally rather than outwardly. Care is felt before it is shown. Connection is assumed before it is reinforced. Presence is carried even when it is not signaled. This internal continuity feels natural from the inside. The bond feels active. Nothing seems missing. But expectations are not always shared automatically. Some friendships carry unspoken assumptions about visibility. how often connection should be marked, how quickly response should arrive, how care should look when it is present. When these assumptions differ, quiet disappointment can form without being named. The introverted mind may believe the relationship is steady. The other person may be waiting for reassurance. Neither perspective is wrong. They are simply operating from different internal cues. Neurologically, expectation is shaped by how connection has been reinforced in the past. Some systems rely on frequent signaling to maintain safety. Others rely on consistency over time. When these systems interact, misalignment can occur without awareness. Introverts often assume that what is stable internally is also stable externally. The bond feels intact. There is no sense of urgency. But if the other nervous system relies on outward confirmation, absence may be interpreted differently. This is where disappointment can grow quietly. Not because care is lacking, but because it is being communicated in a different register. The challenge is that introverted care is often subtle. It appears in reliability rather than repetition, in thoughtfulness rather than frequency, remembering details, holding space internally, maintaining emotional continuity without constant contact. These forms of care may not register immediately as reassurance. When disappointment is unspoken, it can create distance over time. The introverted person may sense a shift without understanding why. The other person may feel unseen without knowing how to articulate it. Neither is intentionally withdrawing. Both are responding to internal signals. The nervous system does not always distinguish between absence of signal and absence of care. It reacts to what it can detect. This is why expectation mismatches can feel confusing rather than dramatic. There is no clear rupture, just a subtle change in tone or warmth. For introverts, this can trigger self-questioning. Was something missed? Did something change without notice? Often, nothing has changed internally at all. The bond is still present. Care remains. But the language of reassurance has not matched what the other system needed. Understanding this dynamic reframes quiet disappointment. It is not evidence of emotional neglect. It is evidence of differing nervous system expectations. Introverted friendships tend to rely on assumed continuity. Once trust is established, the bond is carried forward without constant checking. This works well when both systems operate similarly. When they do not, adjustment is sometimes required. But even without adjustment, recognizing the source of strain reduces internal blame. The introverted person is not failing at friendship. They are communicating care in a way that feels natural to their system. The other person is not demanding too much. Their system may simply require different signals to feel safe. Expectation mismatches do not mean incompatibility. They mean translation is needed. Without understanding, disappointment can feel personal. With understanding, it becomes contextual. The relationship is not lacking depth. It is navigating difference. Importantly, this difference does not negate the bond. It highlights where assumptions diverge. When expectation is seen as a nervous system pattern rather than a moral standard, pressure eases. There is less urgency to perform, less sense of having done something wrong. The relationship becomes easier to hold once disappointment is understood as misalignment rather than failure. For introverts, Recognizing this pattern brings relief. The care they feel internally is real. It has not vanished simply because it has not been displayed frequently. Connection has not disappeared. It has simply been expressed quietly. And when that quiet expression is understood for what it is, expectation softens. Disappointment loses its edge. The bond has room to continue without being burdened by unspoken assumptions. Friendship does not break here. It pauses, adjusts, and often resumes with greater clarity. Not through dramatic change, but through understanding settling gently into place. Comparison often enters quietly, not as jealousy, not as judgment, but as a subtle internal question that forms when observing how others relate. Why does their friendship look easier? Why does their connection seem more active? Why does mine feel quieter by contrast? For introverts, this comparison can surface without intention, especially when exposed to visible forms of social closeness. Frequent messages, public affirmation, regular gatherings. The nervous system registers difference before meaning is assigned. What is often being compared, however, is not depth. It is visibility. Social comparison tends to focus on outward markers of connection. How often people interact, how loudly care is expressed, how consistently presence is signaled. These markers are easy to see. They are measurable. They appear concrete, but they do not represent the full structure of a bond. Introverted friendships often operate beneath this surface layer. Connection exists internally before it is displayed externally. Care is carried quietly rather than signaled repeatedly. When comparison centers on visibility alone, the quieter bond can feel insufficient. Not because it is lacking, but because it is less observable. The nervous system reacts to this perceived discrepancy. A slight tension forms. A question of adequacy appears. Am I doing enough? Is my way of relating falling short? These questions arise even when the relationship itself feels stable. Neurologically, comparison increases arousal. Attention turns outward. Internal regulation shifts toward monitoring rather than presence. The mind begins to scan for what might be missing rather than what is already held. This shift can create unnecessary strain. The bond itself has not changed, only the frame through which it is being evaluated. Introverts are particularly vulnerable to this because their relational signals are often internal. They feel connection deeply, but may not externalize it in ways that are easily compared. When comparison is based on outward activity, internal continuity is overlooked. This does not mean comparison is harmful by nature. It is a normal cognitive process. But when applied to mismatched signaling styles, it can distort perception. The quieter bond is not weaker. It is simply less performative. When introverts measure their friendships against visible standards, they may begin to question patterns that are actually aligned with their nervous system. The relationship may still feel regulating, still feel safe, still feel meaningful. Yet comparison introduces doubt. This doubt can lead to unnecessary pressure, an urge to increase output, to signal more frequently, to match a rhythm that does not fit. When this happens, regulation is disrupted. Performance replaces presence. The bond begins to feel heavier than it needs to. Understanding this pattern helps comparison lose its authority. The feeling that something is missing often comes not from the relationship itself, but from the lens being used to view it. Introverted friendships do not always announce themselves. They do not always look active from the outside, but internally, they may be deeply settled. The nervous system recognizes this settlement even when the mind questions it. Comparison fades when attention returns inward, when the question shifts from "how does this look?" to "how does this feel?" The felt sense of connection matters more than its display. Quiet bonds do not need to prove themselves. They simply need to be experienced. When comparison is released, the relationship often feels lighter again. Pressure dissolves. Presence returns. The bond has not changed. Only the noise around it has quieted. Introverted friendships thrive when allowed to exist without measurement, without ranking, without constant reference to other forms. They follow their own rhythm. They hold their own meaning. And when that meaning is allowed to stand on its own, comparison loses its grip. The relationship no longer competes for legitimacy. It simply continues, quietly, steadily, in the way it always has, beneath the surface where real connection lives. Boundaries in introverted friendships often form without announcement. They are not drawn sharply. They are not defended loudly. They emerge gradually, shaped by the nervous system's need for balance. Rather than being decided intellectually, these boundaries are felt. Energy dips sooner than expected. Attention becomes harder to sustain. The body signals that enough has been given. For introverts, boundaries are often physiological before they are conceptual. The mind recognizes limits through sensation rather than thought. This is why boundaries may appear invisible from the outside. Nothing has been stated. Nothing has been refused directly. Yet something has shifted. Contact may become less frequent. Responses may take longer. Availability may narrow gently. This is not punishment. It is calibration. The nervous system is adjusting input to remain regulated. Neuroscience shows that sustained social stimulation increases arousal over time. When arousal exceeds a comfortable range, the body seeks reduction. Boundaries serve this function naturally. They lower demand. They protect capacity. They preserve the ability to remain emotionally present when connection does occur. In introverted friendships, boundaries often take the form of pacing rather than separation. Interaction slows instead of stopping. Distance appears temporarily rather than permanently. This pacing allows the relationship to continue without overwhelming the system. Importantly, these boundaries are not signs of disinterest. They are signs of care for sustainability. When limits are respected internally, resentment does not build. The relationship remains voluntary rather than obligatory. Presence stays genuine. Without boundaries, even meaningful friendships can begin to feel draining. The nervous system associates connection with cost. Avoidance may increase. With boundaries, the opposite occurs. Connection remains accessible. Energy is restored between interactions. Introverted boundaries also tend to be flexible. They shift with context, stress levels, and life demands. What feels manageable one week may feel excessive the next. This flexibility is often misunderstood as inconsistency. But internally, it is responsive regulation. The system is adapting to current conditions rather than enforcing rigid rules. Because boundaries are often unspoken, they can be difficult to recognize. Others may not realize a limit has been reached until distance appears. This can create confusion, not because the boundary is unreasonable, but because it was not signaled explicitly. Yet for introverts, explicit signaling can feel demanding in itself. Explaining limits requires energy. Defending them requires more. So the boundary emerges quietly instead. Understanding this reframes withdrawal. It is not a rejection of the relationship. It is an adjustment that allows the relationship to continue without harm. Boundaries also support trust. When limits are honored internally, the nervous system feels safer. Safety allows openness to return naturally. The bond does not need to be protected through avoidance. It can be maintained through pacing. Over time, introverted friendships often settle into rhythms that reflect these boundaries. Contact finds a sustainable cadence. Expectations adjust without being spoken aloud. The relationship stabilizes around what the system can hold comfortably. This does not mean boundaries are always perfect or painless. Misunderstandings can occur. Distance may be misread. But the boundary itself is not the problem. It is a response to physiological need. When boundaries are understood as protective rather than distancing, guilt begins to fade. Introverts are not failing at availability. They are maintaining capacity. The nervous system is not withdrawing from connection. It is preserving the conditions that make connection possible. Boundaries allow friendship to exist without constant strain. They prevent burnout. They protect sincerity. Without them, even care can become exhausting. With them, care remains intact. Understanding this shifts the meaning of quiet limits. They are not walls. They are filters. They do not block connection. They shape it. And when boundaries are allowed to exist without judgment, introverted friendships often feel steadier, more honest, more sustainable. The bond is not weakened by these limits. It is supported by them. Connection continues, not because everything is always open, but because enough space exists for the nervous system to breathe. In that space, friendship remains possible, not forced, not overextended, simply balanced in a way the body knows how to keep. Closeness, for introverted friendships, is rarely defined by intensity. It is defined by steadiness, by a sense that the connection does not require constant attention to remain intact, by the quiet confidence that presence is available without being demanded. This is where closeness becomes sustainable. After boundaries have settled and rhythms have formed, the relationship enters a different phase. One where the nervous system no longer braces for fluctuation. One where connection feels reliable rather than fragile. The mind no longer scans for signs of loss. It assumes continuity. This assumption changes how closeness is experienced. There is less urgency to check in, less need to confirm attachment, less pressure to keep the bond active through visible effort. Instead, closeness exists as a background state. The relationship is felt even when it is not being interacted with. Care does not rise and fall with frequency. It remains steady beneath the surface. This steadiness allows emotional availability to remain consistent, not heightened, not withdrawn, just present. For introverts, this form of closeness feels regulating. The nervous system does not need to prepare for unpredictability. Interaction no longer feels like a spike in demand. Because of this, connection becomes easier to return to. There is less recovery required, less recalibration. The bond has learned how to exist within the system's natural limits. Closeness also becomes less performative at this stage. There is no need to demonstrate importance through constant signaling. The relationship does not rely on proof. It relies on familiarity. Shared history carries weight here. Past experiences reinforce the sense that the bond is real. The nervous system draws from memory to maintain connection during absence. This memory is not cognitive alone. It is felt. The body recognizes the other person as safe. Their presence is associated with ease rather than effort. This association changes how closeness feels internally. It becomes quieter, less charged, more grounded. Importantly, this does not mean emotional distance. It means emotional stability. The relationship is not constantly activating. It does not need to be. Introverted closeness often appears understated from the outside. There may be fewer visible interactions, less outward affirmation, but internally, the bond may feel deeply secure. This security allows space for individuality. Time apart does not threaten closeness. Silence does not weaken it. The nervous system trusts that connection will return when needed. This trust reduces anxiety around maintenance. The relationship no longer feels like something that could disappear without attention. It feels anchored. Because of this anchoring, introverts may feel closest to those they interact with less frequently, but more consistently over time. The bond is not defined by activity. It is defined by continuity. This kind of closeness also supports longevity. There is less burnout, less emotional fatigue. The relationship can exist alongside other demands without competing for energy. When closeness is sustainable, it does not crowd the nervous system. It fits. This fit allows introverts to remain emotionally open without becoming overwhelmed. They do not need to choose between connection and regulation. Both are possible at once. Understanding this reframes what closeness looks like. It is not always visible. It is not always intense. Sometimes it is simply the knowledge that someone is there, that the bond does not need constant reinforcement, that care can remain quiet and still be real. This form of closeness does not announce itself. It settles. And once it has settled, it becomes one of the most sustaining aspects of introverted friendship. The relationship no longer demands energy to stay alive. It offers stability instead. The nervous system rests inside the bond rather than working to maintain it. Connection feels like a place rather than a task. And in that place, introverted friendships find a depth that does not fluctuate with time or distance. They continue quietly, not fading, not intensifying, simply existing in a form the mind recognizes as safe, steady, and enough. Vulnerability in introverted friendships often arrives indirectly, not through sudden disclosure, not through emotional intensity, but through small moments that repeat without consequence. It appears in what is allowed to be unfinished, in what does not need to be explained, in what can remain present without being resolved immediately. For introverted minds, Vulnerability is not a performance. It is a condition of safety. The nervous system does not open because it has decided to. It opens because it no longer feels the need to protect itself. This is why vulnerability often emerges later in introverted friendships. Not because trust is withheld, but because trust must first be embodied. Before vulnerability appears, the body watches. It notices whether emotion is handled gently, whether silence is tolerated, whether boundaries are respected without pressure. Each of these moments contributes to an internal calculation, not conscious, not verbal. The system is learning whether openness will increase regulation or disrupt it. When emotional expression has been met consistently with steadiness, the body relaxes its defenses. Alertness softens. Monitoring decreases. Only then does vulnerability begin to surface. It may show up as a quiet admission, a thought shared without framing, a feeling expressed without apology. Often, it arrives without ceremony. There is no announcement that something important is being shared. The moment passes as part of the ongoing rhythm of the relationship. This subtlety can make introverted vulnerability easy to miss. It does not resemble emotional intensity. It does not demand response. But internally, it carries weight. The nervous system has allowed something unguarded to be present. This is not accidental. It is the result of repeated safety. Importantly, vulnerability here does not overwhelm the system. It does not flood awareness. It does not destabilize regulation. Because it emerges gradually, it integrates smoothly. This is one of the key differences in how introverted friendships deepen. Vulnerability does not arrive as a turning point. It arrives as a layering. Each small opening rests on the last. Nothing needs to be rushed. The relationship does not change dramatically after vulnerability appears. It simply feels slightly more settled, slightly more familiar. This quiet integration allows vulnerability to exist without aftermath. There is no need for reassurance, no need to revisit or manage the moment. The bond absorbs it naturally. For introverts, this is essential. When vulnerability creates emotional spikes, it becomes costly. When it remains within regulation, it becomes sustainable. The nervous system learns that openness does not require recovery. It does not require repair. It can simply exist. This learning deepens trust further. The body now recognizes that emotional truth can be shared without destabilizing the relationship. From the outside, the friendship may still appear calm. Nothing dramatic has changed. But internally, something important has occurred. The system has expanded its sense of what is safe. This expansion does not lead to constant disclosure. It leads to comfort. Vulnerability becomes something that can be accessed when relevant, rather than something that must be expressed to prove closeness. It is available, not demanded. Understanding this reframes the idea that introverts are emotionally closed. What appears closed is often simply protected until safety is confirmed. Once safety is present, vulnerability does not need to be pushed forward. It arises naturally, in proportion to what the system can hold. This proportion matters. Too much, too fast, overwhelms. Too little, too guarded, prevents depth. Introverted vulnerability finds its balance through pacing. The relationship becomes a place where truth can surface quietly, without pressure to escalate. Nothing needs to be intensified to be meaningful. In this way, vulnerability strengthens introverted friendships without destabilizing them. It adds depth without adding weight. The bond remains calm. Regulation remains intact. Connection deepens without becoming loud. And over time, this quiet vulnerability becomes part of the relationship's texture. Not a moment to remember, but a state that feels normal. The nervous system no longer distinguishes sharply between guarded and open. It rests somewhere in between, safe enough to be real, contained enough to remain steady. In that space, vulnerability is not something that happens. It is something that exists, quietly, reliably. And because it exists without strain, it continues to be available whenever the relationship needs it. Conflict in introverted friendships tends to move differently. It rarely arrives as confrontation. It often appears as discomfort, a subtle tightening in the body, a shift in tone that feels slightly off. For introverted minds, conflict is first experienced internally. Before words form, the nervous system registers change. Attention sharpens. Energy turns inward. The body begins assessing safety. This assessment happens quickly and quietly. Is this interaction still predictable? Is emotional demand increasing? Is regulation being challenged? Because of this, conflict is often managed before it is named. Introverts tend to reduce stimulation when tension appears. Conversation slows. Responses become more measured. Space is allowed to form naturally. This is not avoidance, it is stabilization. The nervous system seeks to return to a manageable state before engaging further. Without regulation, expression feels risky. With regulation, clarity becomes possible. Many introverted friendships resolve conflict through this initial settling phase alone. The tension softens as predictability returns. The relationship re-enters familiar rhythm. No escalation is required. When conflict does need to be addressed, it often happens later. After the body has settled, after emotional charge has decreased, words arrive with more precision. Emotion is expressed without flooding. The focus remains on restoring steadiness rather than winning resolution. This pacing reduces harm. Neuroscience shows that high emotional arousal narrows perspective. When arousal decreases, cognitive flexibility returns. The system can consider nuance instead of reacting defensively. Introverted conflict management relies on this principle naturally. Regulation first, expression second. This is why introverted friendships may appear conflict-free from the outside, not because disagreement never occurs, but because it rarely becomes visible. The work happens internally. Tension is processed quietly. Meaning is clarified inwardly. Only what feels necessary is expressed outwardly. This selective expression preserves the relationship from unnecessary strain. Not every discomfort becomes a rupture. Not every difference requires full exploration. The nervous system learns which signals matter. Importantly, this does not mean introverts suppress emotion indefinitely. Unresolved tension still registers, but it is held until it can be addressed safely. This holding is not repression, it is timing. When timing is right, communication tends to be grounded, less reactive, more focused on restoration. The goal is not to discharge emotion, it is to re-establish equilibrium. This approach also reduces the after effects of conflict. There is less lingering arousal, less emotional residue. The relationship can return to baseline without prolonged recovery. Over time, this creates a sense of security. Disagreement does not threaten the bond. Tension does not signal instability. The nervous system trusts that the relationship can absorb difference without collapsing. This trust changes how future conflict is experienced. There is less fear, less urgency. The body knows that regulation will return. Introverted friendships often grow stronger through this quiet handling of conflict. The bond proves itself resilient without needing dramatic repair. This resilience is subtle but powerful. From the outside, the relationship may appear unchanged. From the inside, confidence has increased. The system has learned that connection does not require constant harmony. It requires safety during disharmony. Understanding this reframes introverted conflict. It is not avoidance. It is containment. The nervous system is protecting the relationship by controlling intensity. This control allows conflict to be integrated rather than amplified. Nothing needs to explode for something to be resolved. Nothing needs to be declared for something to be understood. Sometimes, steadiness itself is the resolution. The relationship moves forward with slightly more awareness, slightly more trust, slightly more confidence in its ability to hold difference. Conflict becomes part of the shared history rather than a threat to it. Quietly handled, carefully absorbed. And because of this, introverted friendships often feel calm even after difficulty. Not because nothing happened, but because what happened did not overwhelm the system. The bond remains intact. The rhythm resumes. And beneath that rhythm, the nervous system carries the knowledge that even tension can pass without damage. That knowledge settles in. And once it has settled, conflict loses its power to disrupt. It becomes another experience the relationship knows how to hold. Acceptance arrives quietly, not as a conclusion, but as a loosening of effort. A moment where the relationship no longer needs to be interpreted, adjusted, or questioned as often. It simply exists in the shape it has taken. For introverted friendships, this acceptance is deeply regulating. The nervous system recognizes when it no longer has to monitor for misalignment, when expectations have softened, when the bond no longer feels at risk of being misunderstood at every pause or silence. The mind stops scanning for what should be different. This does not mean the relationship is static. It means it is no longer being evaluated against an external template. Earlier, attention may have been spent wondering whether the friendship was sufficient, whether the pace was right, whether the quiet was acceptable. As acceptance settles, those questions fade. The relationship begins to be experienced directly rather than measured. Acceptance here is not resignation. It is alignment. The nervous system recognizes that the bond fits within its natural rhythms. There is room to engage, room to rest, room to return. Nothing needs to be forced into clarity. This acceptance often follows a long period of internal learning, understanding how energy moves, recognizing the role of recovery, seeing how trust accumulates. Once these patterns are understood, self-blame releases its grip. The introverted person no longer feels the need to justify the shape of their friendships. The quiet does not feel like absence. The space does not feel like loss. care is allowed to remain subtle. This internal permission changes how connection feels. There is less tension during silence, less urgency during distance, less pressure during interaction. The bond feels easier to carry. Acceptance also allows the relationship to breathe. It is not held tightly. It is not tested constantly. The nervous system knows that closeness does not need to be guarded. It does not disappear when attention turns elsewhere. This creates emotional steadiness. Introverted friendships often reach this stage later rather than sooner. Not because something was missing earlier, but because understanding had to catch up with experience. Once acceptance is present, the relationship stops being a question. It becomes a constant. The bond does not need explanation. It does not need reassurance. It simply remains available. Importantly, acceptance does not eliminate all moments of doubt, but it changes their weight. When uncertainty arises, it passes more quickly. The nervous system has enough evidence to settle itself. The relationship has proven its durability. This allows introverts to remain open without feeling exposed, to care without overextending, to stay connected without performing. The bond becomes something that can be trusted. Acceptance also reduces comparison. The relationship no longer needs to resemble others. It only needs to feel right internally. The nervous system becomes the reference point. This shift brings relief. Friendship no longer feels like something that must be maintained through vigilance. It feels like something that continues through shared understanding. As acceptance deepens, interaction becomes more natural. Expression flows when it is needed. Silence rests when it is not. There is less effort to manage impressions, less need to explain pacing. The relationship exists on its own terms. This is often when introverted friendships feel most stable, not because activity has increased, but because pressure has decreased. The bond has found its equilibrium. Understanding has replaced anxiety. Trust has replaced monitoring. The nervous system rests inside the connection rather than working to protect it. Acceptance does not announce itself. It feels like calm, a sense that nothing needs to be adjusted right now, that the relationship can simply continue as it is. And in that calm, introverted friendships often reach their most sustainable form. Quiet, steady, uncomplicated by expectation. The bond does not ask for more than the system can give, and the system no longer worries about giving too little. They meet in the middle. That meeting point does not need attention. It does not need validation. It simply holds. And when friendship reaches this place, it becomes less about effort and more about presence. A presence that remains, not loudly, not visibly, but consistently in a way the mind recognizes as enough. As we come to the end of this quiet exploration, nothing here asks you to change how you connect. There is no ideal pace to match, no volume to increase, no pattern that needs correcting. What we've been doing tonight is noticing how introverted friendships form, how they are held, and how they continue, often without drawing attention to themselves. If parts of this felt familiar, it isn't because you learned something new about who you should be. It's because you recognize something that has likely been present for a long time. The pauses, the steadiness, the way connection lives quietly rather than loudly. Science does not frame this as absence. It frames it as regulation, as a nervous system that values depth, predictability, and sustainability. Friendship does not require constant signal to remain real. It does not require expansion to have meaning. And it does not fade simply because it rests. Introverted connection often survives precisely because it is allowed to breathe. As you settle into the rest of your night, there is nothing to carry forward except understanding. An understanding that quiet bonds are still bonds. That silence can still hold care. That fewer connections can still be full. Nothing here needs to be fixed. Nothing needs to be proven. If you're listening as sleep begins to arrive, you can let these thoughts drift without holding on to them. They do not need attention to stay true. Thank you for spending this time here, in this calm space, where connection is allowed to be gentle, and understanding is allowed to arrive slowly. The quiet continues, just as it is.